What's going on, Clarence?
Cornmeal.
Let's do it. D-man alright. Whoa. D-man alright. Spicy mafia. D-man alright. Spicy mafia. You gotta keep it spicy. If you see a queen, you better wife it. While we litter than a lighter, it makes things much brighter. So you gotta keep it spicy. You gotta keep it spicy. Gotta keep it spicy. Gotta keep it spicy.
So we're very lucky to have Max Gulker from AIER, the American Institute for Economic Research. He has written a fantastic essay called "What Martin Luther Can Teach Us About Bitcoin," and it's nutrient dense, calorie poor in terms of being a short bite. There, you don't have to, spend 2 days reading it, but lots and lots of food for thought. And I've really taken this gastronomy metaphor a little too far here. But before I get further along here, Max, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and yes, happy to add some food to your table for thought.
Yeah, it's a really cool essay, and I came across it by accident. I think I follow you at least on Twitter. I know AIER I follow, and really it's a really happy accident. Gave me a lot to think about. So before we get into the essay here, what Martin Luther can teach us about Bitcoin, a little bit about who you are and your background.
Yes, so I am an economist who can put a fancy doctor in front of my name if I want to. Usually try to avoid doing that. I did my PhD now, finished a little over 10 years ago at Stanford, which I joke with my kind of Austrian-influenced friends now is the George Mason of economics for non-libertarians. But I came to more of a kind of free market, let's say Austrian-influenced Bitcoin enthusiast type position, kind of over the years in a series of happy accidents myself. It's funny, that's really kind of how I view the importance of markets, is because they let those happy accidents happen. So I joined AIER about 4 years ago. I'd worked in the private sector on lots of fancy commercial litigation in New York City before that, and didn't like where I was headed with that. Didn't like living in New York anymore. Now I live in the middle of nowhere, Western Massachusetts. We love it. The team here has just been fantastic, and sort of the stable of authors we've assembled. I'm just proud to have my name up there with them every day. So it's been great.
Yeah, and I come to learning about AIER through my limited association with Jeffrey Tucker out at the Foundation for Economic Education, and so he made the jump over to you all once the great Edward Stringham had taken the reins there. Can you tell us a little bit about AIER and what that's all about?
Yeah, so so when Ed took over, which was actually a little after I joined, another happy accident. The place, we were founded in the 1930s by an engineer at MIT who was sort of a self-taught economist, but really ended up being kind of a heavyweight in the field and corresponding with folks like Hayek. And Harwood was, it was the years of the Great Depression. He was worried about what he saw as kind of increased government intervention through the New Deal. And he started writing about that and developed, a following. He's sometimes not a name that's known in academic circles, but he wrote quite a lot and made kind of quite a few contributions, knew quite a few people. And he passed away in 1980. He had moved from Cambridge to a kind of fixer-upper mansion out in the woods in Western Massachusetts in the 1940s, but he fixed that up extremely well, and our campus is still here with that house, along with office building and some other things. So when Ed joined, it was really to help kind of bring us, in some ways back. It's funny to be writing about Bitcoin and talking about going back to our roots here from the 1930s, but right. I guess I've gone back to the Renaissance roots of Bitcoin with this article. But I think that we have been able to do that so well through Ed's vision. If you don't know Ed Stringham, he's an economist who's written a terrific book called Private Governance that was influential on me kind of having a libertarian outlook and learning that governance and government are not necessarily the same thing, that we can have ways of organizing ourselves as a society, of coordinating our actions without a state, essentially putting a gun to your head implicitly. And when we had the chance to get Jeffrey, we absolutely jumped on it. And as you know, Jeffrey's a force of nature. You said your limited interaction with him. My unlimited interaction with him has been truly a gift. He really has just his vision and his focus towards getting there, and his kind of sense of purpose. When there's something that Jeffrey Tucker wants to do now, he does it now, and that's almost always a great thing. And that we have brought in a lot of folks that may be people who are kind of fans of economics on the Austrian free market, public choice kind of side. We have lots of professors whose names you might know. Everybody's writing kind of shorter articles intended for, the general informed, interested public. Visit our site, AIER.org. And I think you'll, if you're listening to this podcast, I think you'll find at least some things you'll love there.
Totally agree. And Stringham, who is the president of AIER right now, is, if I recall correctly, because I followed him for years, he was one of the first reasonably well-known academics to come out in favor of Bitcoin. And he's written, as you say, that book, but also a collection of he edited Anarchy and the Law before then. And he's just done some amazing research on drinking and productivity, and just one of these great guys that you just love to hear talk. And it's nice that you guys have landed at AIER. So yes. Very cool. That leads us to then what Martin Luther can teach us about Bitcoin. And right away, I have to ask, how did you even think about writing something like this?
So I'll get to the specifics in a second. As a little bit of background, I come to the kind of crypto world, again, from maybe a point that a lot of people, that's different than a lot of people. It's really only been a few years I've been observing it. It was actually kind of Ed and I who figured out, or who kind of talked early on in his tenure here about us having a voice in that debate, in that space, which I started developing. And then obviously Jeffrey already had quite a voice in that space, and he joined us. And I think we've been pretty much in line with a lot of our thinking a lot of the time. Now, I am, among economists who think about Bitcoin, I'm probably a little unique in that I'm not a monetary economist per se. I haven't spent my career thinking about things like the gold standard and inflation. My field of specialty in graduate school is called industrial organization, IO. Really, let's think about that as applied microeconomics, thinking about markets and firms and competition. And I've always had one foot in between that and my private sector work in kind of the world of new technology. I'm fascinated by new technology. I love the way we can watch these things happen in real time now, and sort of the cultural aspects of how people react to it. And because of that, I've just every so often written one of these articles, and it's become a joke, the what blank can teach us about Bitcoin. You'll see that there's a what travel agents can teach us about Bitcoin somewhere on the site. There's at least a couple more that I should have written down in front of me, but I don't. But in terms of the Martin Luther connection, so the printing press is obviously something I've thought about when I've tried to get a historical perspective from time to time and thought about, look, what can, if this invention of blockchain technology, whether it's Bitcoin or something else, is going to be super important, what are these super important inventions in history that we can compare it to? And obviously the printing press is sort of on a short list of things like that people talk about. But then this is a very, 21st century internet kind of story. I sometimes listen to a podcast called Tides of History, which for history podcasting fans is always a good time. And I was, sometimes I'll listen to these podcasts kind of as I'm going to bed or something like that. And I put one on one night, and it's an interview with this author, Andrew Pettegree, of this book I think that came out a couple of years ago called Brand Luther. And he starts talking about Martin Luther and the printing press, and I'll get into the specifics of the story in a second, but he's talking about sort of technological history, religious history. It was like, oh my God, all the things I love right in one place. And so that did not put me to sleep. And I subsequently went and I found the book. I was driving up to Vermont, and I found the book on Audible and listened to it, and it's fantastic. I really recommend it. Again, that's Brand Luther by Andrew Pettegree.
We'll have a link to
that was sort of where I got
to
and how I found it. Go ahead.
Oh, no, very good. I was just saying we'll have a link to that in the show notes for sure. So you're prompted then by the podcast and the audiobook Brand Luther by Andrew Pettegree. And I guess we should start with kind of the basics here for listeners who are unaware. I'm assuming they have a passing familiarity, but who was Martin Luther, for example?
Right. So Martin Luther is the kind of catalyst for what we call the Reformation, which is the schism that happened in the 1500s between Catholicism and what we now call Protestantism, which is almost all of the other major Christian religions. Now, before I get completely over my head talking about the Reformation and the theological instances there, this is something that caused a huge amount of upheaval in Europe, and obviously affects sort of the religious landscape we see to this day. But it also, as I really discovered through this book, had a major impact on the use of printing, the understanding of printing, and that's really where ultimately Bitcoin loops back in. So let me. Is it okay if I just talk a little bit about the printing press, kind of when it first was invented?
Sure, because that's how we get to Gutenberg.
Exactly. So let's go back about 100 years before Luther. And Gutenberg, Johannes Gutenberg, invents the printing press in Europe. And everybody knows it's going to be huge, basically. And it becomes the next cool thing for Europe's royalty to buy. So if you're, a prince, bishop, what have you, somewhere in your domain, you want to have a printing press. That's going to be a status symbol. And there are, so originally it's the Gutenberg Bible is the first sort of widely understood thing to be printed. But within a few decades, I wish I had the timeline in front of me, but sort of wildfire by Renaissance standards. So it sounds like a long time now. We've got printing presses in about 200 cities and towns in Europe. And so that is, by, like I said, the standards of the day, fast technological diffusion. Now, what happens next, and this is where my ears really kind of perked up when I heard this, is there's a bubble that bursts. And
this was really interesting because this is a part of economic history that I didn't really know. I didn't realize there was a.
This is the part I didn't know either, and this was kind of really the hook in there. Is something like 2/3 of those printing presses end up going out of business, end up basically getting shut down, and the reason is they don't really know what to do with a mass-produced book. Okay, and so keep in mind when I say this, that this is something that seems so obvious to us today, that obviously wasn't, and took a huge amount of time for them to figure out. And so before the printing press, you basically had one-to-one transactions for books. You're a rich person, you want a book, you go to a scribe, you say, I want this book. They say, all right, I'm gonna write it up, I'm gonna calligraphy it up, and you get your, you know, fancy luxury item, right? There was not a real concept of bookstores, first of all, at all, or, you know, even the idea of someone writing a book in like a language people spoke that then they were going to like read and learn something from. These are all such foundational things in our society now that it's quite incredible to step back and appreciate not only that virtually every major technology I can think of is associated with at least some kind of bubble at first.
Right.
And second, that that the use of this technology took really that long, and then a catalyzing event to even to even kind of crystallize in people's minds.
So really the which again, as you've said a few times now, that it's so automatic in our minds to have a printing press and to have you know, we think it would just sort of take off and go. People were certainly impressed by it, and they saw its utility and maybe its value proposition, but on the other hand, it's sort of kind of run its course, and no one could really figure out what the ultimate point of it was. And you write, and this was what I was struck by, I think it's in the second paragraph here, we should still have very little idea how to use it when you're talking about blockchain and the idea of cryptocurrencies. So that begins your thesis to kind of weave us into this idea of the printing press. So you use the word catalyst. So something needs to come along, because obviously the printing press becomes ubiquitous, and again, we have all the luxuries and treasures that accompany it. But what do you imagine was the actual catalyst to get us thinking further about it?
Oh, sorry. So first of all, I think it's briefly worth mentioning that the printing presses that did sort of survive these leaner years, according to Pettegree, and I'm really getting this story, not the blockchain part, but this story really from this book. They really survived by sort of serving the powers that be. In a word, they were printing, you know, for the state, they were printing for the government, kind of, you know, leaflets and flyers and very practical things, and then for the church as well, including, somewhat ironically, indulgences, which are these kind of get out of jail free cards that you buy during that era in the Catholic Church that, again, I'm going to butcher the theology if I get into, but that's one of the things that starts Luther on his kind of quest to reform the Catholic Church. And so for our purposes, what's really is Luther is in this town, Wittenberg, Germany, that has a printing press, although the guy who's running it is this kind of hapless, like, everybody seems to like him, but he doesn't do a great job. There's probably one of those in everybody's office. You know, this sort of avalanche of kind of, you know, public attention. Luther is becoming this celebrity by the standards of the day, which, you know, if you think about already how, in terms of their information technology, you know, how rare that must be. And he kind of sees the need. So part of his theology, part of what he's criticizing the Catholic Church for, is the Catholic Church keeps the Bible in Latin. And it basically says, no, you don't read the Bible, we read the Bible, and our priests tell you what it says. And Luther says, no, people should read the Bible for themselves. And so here's, you know, a little kind of ray of sunshine of individual freedom here through the clouds. I I won't by any means say the try to turn Martin Luther into a libertarian or something. But
well,
but,
and just to defend the poor Catholic Church that always gets beat up in these discussions, there was some thinking among historians and theologians who look back at that time, and there's been a slight revision of the idea that perhaps they had a point, that if you let the hoi polloi with this kind of holy text interpreted on their own, pretty soon you're going to have guys in Alabama with snakes kicking chickens, right? So,
well, first of all, I'm Jewish, and so I'm a neutral observer. Frankly, your history is way more interesting than ours. So I study the papacy. I'm really we have Phil Magnus, who's another one of our full-time researchers, who just has a spectacular mind as an economic historian. I've become conversant on a few topics with him, and it's all from the history podcast, basically.
No worries. No worries at all. But my point was just that, because I'll try to connect it later to maybe readings of the white paper and how that now has become controversial.
Yeah,
in Bitcoin
and stay with it. That's really interesting.
But anyway, keep going.
Yeah. So let's try. Yeah, let's get us back on track here. So Luther goes and gets actually originally a second printer who's more of a pro to come to the city, and it's funny, they start kind of subtly guiding work around this other guy and stuff. But what happens then is that he and the circle around him and the printers kind of together create a lot of kind of what we understand now as the best-selling author and what that entails. And that includes things like a look to his material. Like, they realize he's printing these different pamphlets, and ultimately he's printing the Bible in his translation in the vernacular German. And they realize that, these books are increasingly being sold at sheds and stalls and markets, and they need a way to catch people's eye to say, oh, that's another Martin Luther piece. So they develop a look, kind of branding, almost, which is where the title of the book comes from. And another just interesting tidbit I thought was that, other than if it was a revered figure from antiquity, some Greek or Roman philosopher, traditionally you wouldn't have put the author's name on the front of the book before Luther.
I never realized that.
So Luther is becoming this public intellectual in a way where by Martin Luther becomes something that's important to people. So that's really kind of the catalyzing event. And so we can kind of circle around and talk about how it relates to Bitcoin and blockchain technology if you want.
Right, and I think there's a perfect corollary here. But so they have this technology. Everybody realizes it's something. They just don't know exactly what it is in the way that we imagine it today, which is a perspective that really only you can have as someone in 2019 looking back at that time. So they really didn't know what they had. And so your point is to sort of, one of my favorite words is sobriety, but is to introduce some sobriety into what has become a very, very tribal, very heated debate in cryptocurrency circles, is to say, slow down, because look at this obvious piece of tech, half a millennia ago, and how all of us now see it so clearly, and what it was to become and evolve into. But knowing these little patches where, like you say, you've unearthed, or Pettegree, I guess, has unearthed this notion of a bubble, that it really could have just gone away. Like, I can see a scenario historically, if we run say a parallel universe where we get the Western culture gets the printing press, but maybe there's a guild, say a scribes guild or something, that gets the wields the powers of the state. They pass a law against it. They destroy all these things, and or there's a market choice, right? People just, I prefer the handwritten. I don't like these cheap knockoffs, and those things die by the wayside, and we don't get kind of the intellectual revolution that we did. And you say for that to happen, it takes a catalyst. It takes something to move it on forward, and that's
yeah.
where
Well, a lot of times, for I respect and admire your courage in jumping down the alternative history rabbit hole. I don't have quite the guts to join you there, but exactly. What the thought that struck me, especially because we had this kind of little informal series going, was that is amazing how long it took a technology that it's that obvious today in hindsight how to use for them to figure out what to do with it. And part of that, of course, is that they're in a time when information still traveled very poorly, in part because this wasn't figured out yet. But it took a vast schism in society and religion, which was society at that point. For someone to have such a, at the time, revolutionary idea. And I do want to be careful when we talk about these kind of historical comparisons, because we're not saying this is not some study with 1,000 observations where we're saying this must happen because it happened this one time. These are just sort of broader lessons that we can stand back and look at. But if we look at Bitcoin and the white paper, and we're about 10 years old here, and and blockchain is something that we would call a foundational technology, right? Sort of like the World Wide Web or something like that, where it's a technology that then other people often design applications for. And what really attracted me to thinkers like Hayek in economics is the role of information in markets, and the fact that the market is an evolutionary learning process, right? I often kind of make the crack that capitalism isn't conservative because it's a bottom-up evolutionary process of change at its core. How could that possibly be conservative? But now, why do we need markets? Why are markets essential? Markets are essential because we can't write down in advance what's going to happen. And in fact, we do such a bad job of writing down in advance of what's going to happen that, it took several decades for people to figure out how to have a bookstore, right? And so it's not known to me any examples of sort of foundational technologies where their killer app, the thing that's going to really use it to change the world, is invented side by side with it. And that's not to say Satoshi's invention wasn't, stunning in its own way, but we tend to tell these stories about great technologies in history where we say, oh, the printing press came along and then the written word could be, obtained by everybody. And all of those stories almost always obscure like decades of just, unknown chaos, if you want to.
Sure.
That's not a scientific term, but again, especially a comparison that I like to make to the internet is that when people having, and this is one of those interesting kind of cultural things, I think people have this perception that the internet sort of fell from the sky and changed the world in like 5 to 10 years. And, we kind of saw that revolution happen. And what people forget is that, like, the Bitcoin white paper is not equivalent to like 1995 or whenever, the World Wide Web started becoming fairly common, right? We're talking about like several decades before that as a Defense Department, when the internet was sitting there and they were experimenting with it, and they were, right? It's so even that took a long time to develop. So when Bitcoin maximalists say Bitcoin must, not only should be the only currency that anyone ever uses, or might be the only currency they ever use, but must be the only currency anybody uses, and they talk about that inevitability, it just stuns me that a lot of people who purport to be influenced by economics, let alone Austrian economics, which has this kind of Hayekian discovery process in markets, could possibly think that we know exactly how this thing is going to turn out. That to me seems baffling or willfully ignoring things that they know because they don't want to deal with them.
Yeah, and it's there are some ominous parallels here between, which wasn't your point, the Reformation and sort of orthodoxy, and we've seen a Luther like, again, this is not your point, but I'm trying to draw these parallels.
Sure.
A Luther like, so we have the revealed, right? The Messiah comes down, he's unknown, he delivers us this wonderful gift. And then
stop talking about Jeffrey Tucker that way. Just kidding. Kidding. He's not Satoshi, or is he? I don't know.
It's still up in the air. That's what we're ultimately getting to here. Everything leads to Tucker.
Yeah, we'll keep you posted.
Yeah, and so we get this revealed white paper, the Holy Book, and then there's one way to interpret it, and then all of a sudden, what we call forks, which I guess that you could call the Protestant Reformation if you're going to go fast and quick with it. A fork of the Catholic Church, we call these forks are basically Protestants, and they're reforming based, we can do it better than this and so on. And then you have sort of the one true church kind of holding on to this idea. I see a lot of intellectual parallels there if we again shave off nuance. But I think your point is that we have a group of folks out there who are pressing to sort of impose their will on a historical technology, and you're kind of saying there's just really no way. I mean, you sort of equate them to central planners, right?
Right. Well, it's sort of this idea of, I support Bitcoin because I love the free market, and I love the free market so much that I'm going to yell at it on social media until it does what I want it to do. Right. Yeah, that's not exactly how things work. And, just one side point, but you might be interested in it, is the sort of network effects justification that there can be only one currency. There are network effects in currencies, but when I see crypto, I see something that can be digitally exchanged, or should at least be able to be relatively easily. That to me has network effects that bite way less than, say, paper currencies among, within the boundaries of a nation state. So if anything, I think the network effects are reduced by crypto. But on the larger point, I think that so I've at some points called Bitcoin maximalism. I've referred to it as Bitcoin protectionism, because it's really kind of saying, look, like, we're going to have to go up against, the day is going to come when we're going to have to go up against these nation states and their currencies and these governments that are printing money. We want one currency that's super strong. It's going to take them all on. And, anything you do to not support Bitcoin, which is just your choice in a free market and society, by the way, is, what have you done for Bitcoin is really kind of where that ends up going. And that's that's particularly a like a state-led economic strategy that's called national champions sometimes, where we want to have a car company that serves the nation's interest. And and you can see a little bit of when, like General Motors got bailed out and things like that, you can see a little bit of that thinking kind of in there. To me, no currency that everybody sort of beforehand decides or is shouted at to decide to support is going to be that strong. And I'm not making a statement about Bitcoin there. Notice that I'm very, very clearly steering away from talking about the sort of computer science background and which currency is better in that regard. I'm being agnostic about that, but I'm saying in my career studying markets and studying technology, the use cases of a technology, if it's a technology worth using, evolve through time, and that's usually a process of several decades, even in this day and age.
Wow. So I remember, and for us who work day to day in the crypto sphere here, it seems like it's been forever, but with you giving it some perspective, it's certainly just been a blink of an
Yeah.
eye.
And I think that's really important. Sorry, is right, because of those stories we tell about technologies in the past, we often then think that these changes are supposed to be instant or they're supposed to be a few years, and then we sit around kind of waiting like, well, when's it going to happen? And the one thing I can guarantee is it doesn't happen on our schedule.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And so you're looking for a catalyst, or your sort of thesis is that there might be a catalyst, and I'm assuming you mean a movement, maybe not necessarily a Superman in the Lutheran sense, but you're looking for a catalyst that will ultimately show us what cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, sort of the Kleenex to the
right.
I
would say the catalyst is an important point, and it's an important element of it. I think the evolutionary process is really the key here. But a lot of times, I mean, for those of you who know a little bit of evolutionary biology, like, you have mass extinction events, and you have things that oftentimes, to have new things evolved, you need something to shake things up. Just as a side point, I had visited the Miami Bitcoin conference. It must have been the beginning of 2018, and then I went back in the beginning of 2019, and I wrote articles about both of those, which I could send you. That the first one was called "Party Like It's 1999: The Beautiful Inevitability of a Blockchain Bubble," and then by the second year, it was clear that had happened, and I was actually writing sort of fancifully about mass extinction events, But again, that is a process that happens with almost every major, technological advancement we've seen. But in terms of catalysts, yeah, if there's a monetary disturbance, if there is something that, that causes a lot of people to maybe take a new look at some libertarian ideas, those are the types of things that I would expect to really increase interest in crypto.
And I read that, and I appreciated that. I just thought maybe you were being too circumspect, because I think it in my mind, you got me thinking just a ton here after I read it for a couple of weeks, actually, or maybe a week. I believe it's going to be something, like you say, that we haven't seen. We definitely need catalyzing events, if not event. And I don't know if it's going to take a world-sweeping tsunami, a la the Protestant Reformation, so much as maybe little cracks this time.
Yeah.
I'm, at least, again, day to day, it's harder for me to see it because I'm so involved in it. But Hong Kong comes to mind. There was just a report out before you and I began recording today that volumes for an exchange called Local Bitcoins, which is more or less, peer-to-peer, exchanging Bitcoin for fiat and vice versa. Volume there is at all-time highs, and we're talking Hong Kong. We're talking, if not the financial capital of the world, certainly up there. With all their protests, it's still, relative to the rest of, fiat and gold and everything else, it's still minuscule, but those volumes are starting to increase. We see some similar activity in places like Venezuela. I wonder if it's going to be a libertarian reckoning or just flat out, need and well. Anyway, so I'll slice with half of that. And where do you come down on? And I think I can already sort of ferret it out, but where do you come down on the digital gold versus, say, medium of exchange idea?
Right. So I would say that, well, first of all, on the catalyst point, just another thing to bring up. And again, this is all speculation. I don't know this is going to happen, but I always marvel at the way there are the strength of libertarian movements in Latin American countries. for the size of the country, it always seems like they have, like a core group of people who are really into those ideas. And I realize it's a backlash against all the socialism that they've had in those countries. And so I wonder, I don't want there to be a President Sanders or Warren, but I wonder if it would, if seeing it not work would help some of my friends on the left kind of come to different conclusions about that. Again, that's not an experiment I feel safe running, but in terms of medium exchange digital gold, I'm again not a monetary economist, and I shy away from commenting on this a lot because I'm always worried I'm gonna sort of say something that's right. But I think in the framework you're putting, it would be more of the medium exchange side. I think that personally, and this I'm sorry if I'm saying something heretical here, but I don't think I am. But to my mind, a lot of why gold is such a robust medium of exchange is that it's, in a way, it's like God's fiat currency. It's like been there for so long that while states have come and gone and that kind of thing, that whether or not you think about this all regressing to something of value or not, in the end, the people who are using it have to believe it's going to keep its value. And that's what crypto would have to do. And the volatility of Bitcoin, frankly, has been quite a problem in that. Although, again, I see this evolving over a long period of time.
Wow. What an incredible conversation. You've just given us, and me in particular, so much to think about. Absolutely fascinating.
Imagine how much I have to think about.
You have to live with yourself.
I know, right? Story of my life.
We've been speaking to the great Max Gulker and his essay, What Martin Luther Can Teach Us About Bitcoin, up now at AIER.org. That's Gulker, Gulker. Max is the man with the plan. Fantastic talking to you. Really appreciate you coming on. How can our listeners follow your work and find you?
Yes. Okay. So I do most of my social media interacting related to work on Twitter. You can find me at Max Gaier, MaxGaier. And you can go to the AIER website. Again, that's AIER.org. It's a difficult acronym with 3 consecutive vowels. I'm not sure I would have gone in that direction, but like I said, we have a rich history. And you'll find a lot of our content there. If you're a Jeffrey Tucker fan, you will find, I still marvel at the fact that Jeffrey can write like 3 times the number of articles I can, but he is just incredible. But and like I said, a lot of other people, big names in kind of the world of related to Austrian economics, like Pete Bettke, George Mason, and others, Phil Magnus and Peter Earl, who work here. So yes, and I think there's also a tag on our site, a Bitcoin and blockchain tag that can take you right to those articles if you're interested in that. And thank you very much for having me on. I try to always just, because I'm sort of late to the party, because I'm not an OG with this stuff, I try to bring a different, maybe slightly more nuanced perspective, and it is very refreshing to speak to someone here who you appreciate that, because I've gone to these conferences before where it feels like people either want to be shouted at that they're going to change the world, or shouted at that they're scam artists so they can argue back, and sort of everything else kind of slips between the cracks.
And that's the reason. The reason I had you on. It's that kind of debate becomes tiresome, and it's nice to have someone with some perspective who can come at it from, as you say, kind of a coin agnostic point of view, just looking at it as it lay and trying to put it in its historical perspective. So,
absolutely,
very, very cool. Thanks again, man, for coming on. And
absolutely,
check the show notes, everybody, and be well, Max.
All right, thank you.